Welcome back to Hidden Wisdom. Before we dive into today's fascinating conversation, I have a few quick community updates for you. First off, our Parting the Veil Women's Retreat is almost full. We officially have just 3 spaces remaining for this summer solstice gathering in southern Utah. If you've been feeling the pull to join us for deep spiritual connection, embodiment, healing, and sacred sisterhood, now is the time to reserve your spot. Next, this Wednesday at 2 p.m. Mountain Time, we are hosting a live virtual fascia release session inside the Hidden Wisdom app. This experience is completely free for all app members and is designed to help release stored tension and emotion from the body through gentle embodiment practices. You can register directly in the app. Then on Thursday this week, we are hosting our live Q&A on navigating your relationship with the church, a grounded and compassionate discussion for those exploring faith, spirituality, expansion, and belonging. This event is also free for new app users, and you can register inside the app. Finally, we have added some beautiful new features to the Hidden Wisdom app, including a living prayer journal. So if you listened to last week's episode on a more mature form of prayer, we have added this resource to help support your ongoing spiritual dialogue and reflection, as well as include new embodiment exercises to help bring these teachings out of the mind and into the body. All right, today's episode is a powerful one. I am joined by Maxine Hanks for a conversation exploring early Christianity, Gnosticism, mysticism, hidden wisdom traditions, and the spiritual streams that existed both within and alongside early Christian thought. We discuss how many of these ancient ideas intersect with the themes of direct divine experience, the divine feminine, inner transformation, and the evolving relationship between institutional religion and personal revelation. Whether you are deeply familiar with these topics or completely new to them, I think this conversation will open important doors of contemplation. So let's dig in. Welcome to Hidden Wisdom. Hidden wisdom exists to initiate truth seekers into the mysteries, gently guiding them toward a lived experience of the divine that awakens and transforms faith without dismantling family or community. This work is about faith renovation and expansion, learning how to inhabit your spiritual foundation more fully, allowing for depth, relationship, and wisdom to grow over time. I'm your host, Megan Farner. Here we explore Christ-centered esotericism, spiritual discernment, embodied wisdom, and the path of initiation, so your faith can mature, deepen, and become more alive. If you're seeking more and wanting to grow with care and integrity, you are in the right place. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Hidden Wisdom. I am so grateful to be joined by my friend and mentor, Maxine Hanks. Maxine is a historian and theologian of gender in religion, specializing in Mormon studies and Christian liturgy. Her training is in gender studies, history, theology, and ministry, and she lectured in women's studies at the U of U, as well as other schools. She has published articles and books on gender, religion, and Utah, with many interviews and podcasts in media. Her book, Women in Authority, Reemerging Mormon Feminism, is absolutely not to be missed. Everyone should read that book. And Maxine, we have been trying to get together for some time, and I believe in divine timing. And so I am so excited that we finally have this opportunity to connect.
Well, thank you, Megan. I know I loved connecting with you. You're a fellow mystic Christian up in Idaho Falls, where I was born. That's my home. So I love that you're in Idaho Falls. It felt like a cool connection. And I love that we're connecting today for Ascension, the holy day when Christ ascends to heaven 40 days after Easter, after the resurrection. So I guess this is part 1. And part 2 will connect for Pentecost, 50 days after Easter, right?
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. I'm so thrilled. And you have so much knowledge and wisdom, and I'm so excited to share today a topic that I have become so passionate about and that I think we are not very literate in, which is really understanding the landscape of early Christianity and Gnosticism and what Jesus did and what happened soon after his life. I think we have all kind of received a particular narrative about that. So I'm really thrilled to learn from you. I think this is very important for us to understand our own faith tradition, and maybe the idea that the restoration isn't exactly what we think. Maybe it's even better. So I'm thrilled to talk about both Ascension and Pentecost in these 2 sessions that we're going to do. Can you tell us a little bit more about your story? I'm sure many people are familiar with some of your background, but can you tell us a little bit more about you and how it is that you came to your own personal relationship with mysticism, with God, and how that has played into your story?
Sure, thanks. Well, I've always been a mystic since I was a little kid. Have mystical experiences and non-ordinary kinds of intuition and dreams and visions and things like that. But when I published my first book, Women and Authority, Reemerging Mormon Feminism, I was excommunicated from the LDS Church for publishing so much cutting-edge feminist theology and recovering our feminist theology from LDS history really early on, before the church was ready for it. So I and some of my contributors were excommunicated. But since then, the church has, and its historians have really been diving much more into that history and that theology. So that enabled me to come back. So I was excommunicated in 1993, and I came back to the church in 2012 because things had evolved. I had evolved and the church had evolved. But during that time out of the church, I went looking for a place to be. And the only thing that made sense to me was to go to early Christianity. Nothing else really pulled for me. So I found a couple of Gnostic churches, one that happened to be here in Salt Lake, the Ecclesia Gnostica. And then I found one also in the Bay Area, the Ecclesia Gnostica Mysteriorum. And one had a male bishop and one had a female bishop. So I worked with both of them. And so during those years, I dived into early Christianity and Gnostic texts and Christian liturgy and sacramental Christianity, studying the Mass, studying liturgy and liturgical training, how to function in a sanctuary as clergy. And I went through some clergy formation, minor orders. I didn't pursue that all the way to priest, although I was kind of, in a way, unofficially a priest when I received a commission and a dispensation from my Gnostic bishop, Rosamond Miller. But I spent about 13 years serving in Holy Cross Chapel, learning the Christian holy days and the Christian year, the seasons and holy days of the year, and how to celebrate those, and the sacramental liturgies, and, like I said, the Mass. And during that time, I dived into the female holy days and discovered an amazing pattern in the Christian year, that the female holy days had not been really seen fully, that they offer a parallel to the holy days focused on Jesus and his journey. There are parallel holy days focused on Mary and her journey. And so I mapped that, and I developed new services for those holy days. And that was my project when I was not Mormon. And then after doing all of that work, I realized that what I went looking for in early Christianity was in Mormonism the whole time. I went looking for the Divine Feminine and Sophia and Mary Magdalene. Those were important to me, and also female authority and ordination. And I found them in early Christianity and in Gnostic Christianity. So I was focused on Gnostic Christianity, which was very focused on the Divine Feminine and the balance of masculine and feminine, and the role of Mary Magdalene and female equality. So I loved that. I studied all of that, and I discovered that it was not only there in early Christian Gnostic tradition, but that LDS tradition had actually restored that in ways that I hadn't realized. So after making that journey, then I came back to the LDS Church and realized that that I could find what I was looking for more fully actually in LDS tradition. And I guess we'll talk about that next time in part 2. I think today we're just going to talk about early Christianity and Gnostic Christianity. And when I come back, part 2, we'll talk about why I found Gnostic Christianity and early Christianity in LDS tradition even better than I had found in Gnostic tradition. So
yeah. I am thrilled for that conversation. That's going to be fantastic. So thank you so much for that background. I so appreciate you and your evolution and the things that you've learned through your own journey. Real quick, before we kind of hop in and start discussing early Christianity, and I wanted to set the stage a little bit that um, this is going to be a different history than many people are familiar with, right? Like, I think we kind of have a tradition that early Catholicism is the closest thing that we can get to Jesus and what he was doing. And what we're going to present today is a very different idea. I would suggest that this does, however, conform to a repeating pattern that we see. And we see this in Mormonism. We see it, I think, with Jesus. I think we see it with Isaiah and other ancients, which is this idea of a mystic, someone who has encountered God for themselves, who wants to share not only their experience, but also they want to inspire other people to have their own encounters with God. And inevitably, that ends up trying to be institutionalized. And that institution is a far cry from what the mystic actually experienced, right? And there's kind of this loss that sometimes take place, a loss of the history, of the authenticity, of the actual gnosis that took place. So that is what we're going to be talking about today, is how that pattern played out with Jesus. Real quick, before we go into that, I think it might be helpful to define Gnosticism and what we mean by that. I think that's a word that can come and sometimes be a little bit triggering. I think that, like everything else, there is wheat and tares in Gnosticism, right? Where you have really beautiful truth and you also have some things that maybe aren't so helpful. Can you define what you mean when you say Christian Gnosticism?
Well, Gnostic Christianity is just one of the many Christianities running around, at that time. There were so many different versions of Christianity. It's pretty hard to identify one true original Christianity. Even at the beginning, you've got different leaders pulling different directions. And even with Paul, the Apostle Paul, you've got kind of going a different direction in a way than the pillars of Jerusalem, Peter, James, and John, and the apostles who knew Jesus personally. But Gnostic Christianity is just one of the many forms of Christianity that emerged during that first, I would say, 50 to 100 years, after the birth of Christ. And Gnosticism just means gnosis. It just means to know spiritually, directly from God, rather than learning through your mind, your intellect. So also, one thing I'll mention, and we'll get into it a little bit more, is that Gnostic Christianity is not one thing. There was not one group. There were lots of different kinds of Gnostics running around, in addition to a lot of different kinds of Christians running around. And so I'll get into that in a little bit later when we get into that. But pretty simply, it just means gnosis, to know the divine through a direct personal connection between your soul, your inner divine self, and its connection to God and to the divine.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yes, I love that definition. Knowledge by experience, right? Which is really wisdom. And we'll talk about the connections to wisdom and to Sophia, I'm sure, as we go on. All right. So let's go ahead and begin. Maybe you can paint the picture for us and help us connect the dots between what may have actually taken place in early Christianity and also where we got the current narrative that we have today.
Yeah, I'll just touch on a few themes. Talking about early Christianity is a gigantic topic, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
hundreds and hundreds of books and studies. But basically, in thinking about the texts, the New Testament, and then apocryphal texts that were outside of the canon of what was approved and gathered in the New Testament, those apocryphal texts show different traditions and different stories, a different version of the story from the version in the Gospels, the four Gospels, and the letters of Paul. And then you have the Gnostic texts, which are basically apocryphal texts, but they have a certain character to them that is really, really focused on the mysteries, learning the mysteries spiritually, directly. And so you have these different traditions. And I'll just say it kind of arises out of that period of time that we're kind of talking about today, ascension. the period of time between Jesus's resurrection and his ascension 40 days later. In the New Testament and the Gospels and the letters, they focus more on the life of Jesus when he was alive as a human being before he goes through resurrection. There are passages and moments in the New Testament where you do see the resurrected Jesus talking to a few disciples. But mostly they deal with the human Jesus. And in the Gnostic texts, what you see is that they are focused more on the teachings of the resurrected Jesus in that period of time between his resurrection and his ascension. So they're focused more on that Jesus and his teachings than on the human Jesus before his resurrection, or ascension, I should say. And another thing that's really interesting is that there are different versions of how long Jesus was teaching his disciples. And this is a really important question, because in the New Testament, in Acts, where Jesus ascends, you have this sense that he tarries with his disciples for 40 days. Between his resurrection and his ascent to heaven, there's 40 days there where he's teaching his disciples, or who've become apostles because they're now witnesses of the resurrected Jesus. And that's really interesting to think about. What was he teaching his disciple apostles in that time period as a resurrected being? The teachings of a resurrected being to his disciples would seem to have a different quality than perhaps the teachings of the human Jesus before he is resurrected, right? In Gnostic texts, and because they focus on the teachings of the resurrected Jesus, the Pistis Sophia, which is a Gnostic text, it talks about how Jesus actually was with his disciples for 11 years, not just 40 days, that he was coming and going back and forth to teach his disciples and mentor them for 11 years, which is really, really interesting. And then there's the Apocryphon of James that says he was teaching them for 18 months. So not just 40 days, but a full 18 months. So you have these three different versions of how long he was working with his disciple apostles to teach them the mysteries of the resurrected Christ. And one more thing I'll mention is that in Christian tradition, early Christian tradition, beginning back in about the 2nd to the 4th centuries, so the 100s to the 300s, there's this tradition that emerges in early Greek and Latin and Coptic and Syriac texts, that Mary also ascended to heaven, that she was assumed to heaven just like Jesus in parallel. It's called the Dormition in the Greek Orthodox tradition, or the Assumption of Mary, and you can see it on the Christian calendar. Catholics celebrate that holy day. It's August 15th. So that's kind of interesting too. So that's just some, those are some ideas around ascension and that role of ascension related to the resurrection and that period of time, 40 days or 18 months or 11 years before Jesus finally ascends to not come back. And then of course, Pentecost is when Jesus sends the Holy Spirit to earth to ignite all of us, to initiate us into entering the cycle of gnosis and redemption that he went through, which is an interesting idea. And we'll talk more about that next time.
Beautiful. Yes. Thank you so much. So what do we know in terms of the kinds of messages that Jesus may have been sharing during that time, and also what happened along the way where the message that got propped up is not maybe the message that Jesus intended?
Right. Some of the best examples of just the sayings of Jesus that were remembered or recorded, the Q text, quel, the French word quel, which means the sayings, the words of Jesus. Those were, the Q text was discerned or kind of excavated by New Testament scholars who looked at the four Gospels and looked at the texts within the four Gospels that appear to be just the sayings of Jesus. And they collected those sayings and compiled a text of just the sayings, which is the Q text. And that's an indication of what he may have said that was retained in oral from oral tradition into textual tradition. Because what you see in the books of the New Testament, as well as Gnostic, some of the Gnostic texts, I would say, or apocryphal texts, is that there are layers. There are earlier layers that are there in the text that appear to be more close to the time of Jesus and more original and closer to his sayings and teachings. And there are other layers that are added by scribes and those who are writing these things down, and later those who are trying to shape the texts to appease, the Roman rule at the time, or to appease different groups politically. So you have these layers of text in the New Testament. Another text, though, that is very much like the Q is the Gospel of Thomas, which scholars disagree on when it was written. There are some who say it's as early as 50, CE, kind of parallel with the letters of Paul, but it's the sayings text. And it's actually a text that was found in the Nag Hammadi, find the cache of all these early Gnostic texts in Egypt, that matches in many ways the Q. It's just the sayings of Jesus. And it says, these are the secret sayings that the living Jesus spoke and that Judas Didymus Thomas wrote down. So that these are the sayings that Thomas wrote down or remembered. And so those two texts really come the closest to capturing the sayings of Jesus or what he might have actually said. And then, of course, the New Testament, is compiled decades later. And even the Gospels, the four Gospels, are written decades later. The Gospel of Thomas may be the earliest. It could have been written anywhere from 50 to 70 CE. And the Gospel of Mark, which is considered the oldest and the first, is written around 70 CE. So, and Mark is an interesting text. It's got some very early passages. But it's interesting because Christianity goes through these stages. First, you have the John the Baptizer, and then the Jesus movements that are gathering disciples. And then after that, that evolves into the post-resurrection movement of the apostles who are going out to far-flung areas to teach and convert people to Christianity. And then you've got the post-apostolic kind of movement and the early church fathers who start bringing up texts and competing with texts. And then you've got the kind of the early church fathers who establish orthodoxy in the 300s, 325. And so you've got these different stages, that Christianity develops through. And you've also got different types of Christianity that emerge. You've got in the Jesus movement, you've got his disciples. And what Jesus is doing is really interesting. It seems that he calls 12 elders of Israel to reconstitute a council of elders from a synagogue. One of the councils that rules in the synagogues was a council of 12 elders representing the 12 tribes of Israel. And so that's what Jesus is doing. He's calling 12 elders to represent the 12 tribes of Israel for his traveling synagogue, because Jesus is leading this movement, this independent movement, apart from the temple hierarchy and apart from the formal synagogues. It's a traveling synagogue. So he's honoring Hebrew tradition by calling 12 elders for this council. And that's where we get the idea in the New Testament, which really gets changed in the New Testament, because in many ways the equality of men and women is to some degree written out of the New Testament, because it's compiled later when the church is trying to protect itself from persecution. But also, you still see many of the early elements of women's equality and inclusion in the New Testament. It preserves the role of Mary Magdalene and the female disciples. Mary Magdalene is mentioned as the leader. She's the first woman mentioned in the list of women in all four Gospels. And she appears in all four Gospels, and she's also the first witness of the resurrection. So she's the first apostle. So those things are still present in the New Testament. They survive, but they become really more pronounced in the Gnostic Gospels, which really profile Mary Magdalene and her role and the women, as well as the secret mystical teachings of Jesus to his disciples. But what we see with Jesus, what we see him doing is honoring his Hebrew tradition with this traveling synagogue and his council of 12 elders, but then he broadens it out, he widens it out to also call disciples, which is a broader category than the 12 elders. And the disciples include the poor, women, the outcast, he's trying to, in a way, transcend his tradition and do this kind of both and thing that honors it, but at the same time radically shatters the hierarchies and the biases and prejudices and exclusions of his time. And so he's bringing in women and the outcast. He's bringing together people who would never normally associate with each other, and they have to work together. They have to learn how to work together and study with the master. He's the rabbi, the master of his students, and they have to learn together. And so it's really interesting. Another thing I'll mention really quick is that out of this Jesus movement, you have all these different types of Christianities that emerge. You end up with the house churches, which begin with Jesus and the Jesus movement. The first house church is Peter's mother's house, where they're gathering at his mother's house. And then also the Bethany, Mary of Bethany, her house, where you see Mary and Martha. Those are the earliest house churches, and then those evolve later into house churches, which evolve into churches. And then you've also got the sort of Jerusalem Christians, the Hebrew Christians. Then you've got Paul, who starts this whole new movement geared toward Gentiles, not Jewish Christians, but secular Gentile Christians. And you've got the Ebionites, the poor ones, who are very esoteric. And you have a lot of different movements, including Gnostic Christians, that start emerging in that first 100 years. And by the end of the first century, you've got all of these emerging. And one thing I love that Karen King said, she said, we only have a tiny fraction of the hundreds, perhaps thousands of texts that these early Christians, all these different types of Christians and movements were using. They were writing texts, they were circulating them, they were using them in their services in their house churches. And we have a lot of texts. You can go to my favorite site, Early Christian Writings online, where they have a whole lot of all the categories of these early Christian texts. They have canonical ones, they have apocryphal ones, they have Gnostic texts. I love that site. And Karen King says that all of the texts that we know about today, which is hundreds and hundreds, are a tiny fraction of what the Christians were developing and using at that time, which I think is really, really interesting. But then, of course, out of those different Christianities emerges a conflict about, this is later. This is anywhere from really in the 2nd century and into the 3rd century. These different Christianities start clashing over, well, who was Jesus really? And what was his relationship to God? And what is the nature of salvation and atonement? So you start seeing these conflicts emerging. And then that comes to a head with these councils, these big church councils that begin with the Council at Nice, where they develop the Nicene Creed. It's organized in 325 by Constantine, Emperor Constantine, who makes Christianity the official religion of the empire. And that first council is trying to decide, who was Jesus, and was he one with the Father? Who was he? Then there's another council in Constantinople in 381 that defines the Trinity and the Holy Spirit. And then there are other councils after that. There are about 3 or 4 more major councils that meet. And what they do basically is they come to an agreement after a lot of arguing as to what is going to be considered orthodox and approved and what is going to be canon. And so what happens at that time, especially in 325 with the Council at Nice, is that a lot of the apocryphal texts and virtually all of the Gnostic texts are seen as heretical and bad, and they're persecuted, and there's an effort to destroy some of these texts. So that's why the Gnostic texts are buried at that time in the early 300s. That's when they're buried at Nag Hammadi and other locations, and to protect those texts, which is really kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was listening to a friend of mine who made the comment of, if anyone should be interested in scriptural texts that got dug up out of the dirt recently, Mormons should really be interested in that, right? And so the Nag Hammadi Library, the Dead Sea Scrolls, these are things that have come about in the last 70 years, right? Starting in the 1940s is when we started I believe the Nag Hammadi library was just uncovered. Is that correct?
Oh gosh.
Anytime ago.
Well, there's kind of three groups of kind of
Mhm.
Gnostic texts. There's the pre-Nag Hammadi texts, which start surfacing in the 1700s. You know,
Mm-hmm.
with the Pistis Sophia, which is one of my favorite texts. It's a very early text. That actually was found, I think, in 1850 or 1851. And then you've got Gnostic texts that were found in the 1700s, 1773, 1760, like the Acts of John and the Hymn of Jesus. You've got texts that were found later, like 1965, and you've got some in the early 1900s, 1900, 1924, the 1920s. So you've got all these Gnostic texts that are being found various places, but then the big cache of Nag Hammadi, the Nag Hammadi cache that was found in Egypt, was found in 1945. And that cache, again, has a whole library. It's considered the Nag Hammadi library. It has so many Gnostic texts that were preserved in one place, like 13 codices or books and 52 individual texts. That's a lot of texts. But you also have another version of some of those Nag Hammadi texts that were found earlier in 1896. You've got the Gospel of Mary and the Apocryphon of John and the Sophia of Jesus Christ and the Acts of Peter. Those were Nag Hammadi texts that were found in the Nag Hammadi cache, but they were also found in other versions earlier in 1895. Then you've got the post Nag Hammadi texts, Gnostic texts, which were found after the Gospel of Judas was discovered in 2006 when I was at Harvard. That was a big, exciting find because I was on fellowship at Harvard as Gnostic clergy right when this new Gnostic text was found. So it was all the rage when I was out there in 2006. And you've also got a text that was found in 1991, the Gospel of the Savior. So that's just like a really quick rundown of those. But when talking about text, I mean, it's again, it's important to remember that what Gnostic texts did was they revised our view of Christianity. Until the Gnostic texts, especially, were really starting to be discovered and used in 1945, and since then, the view of Christianity came from the Bible and then the few Christian scholars who were working on early Christianity. But what we had was mostly this Orthodox view along with some historical research. The Gnostic texts radically revised our view because they recorded this whole other side of Christianity, early Christianity, that was the mystic side and the side of the secret teachings of Jesus during that period of time when he was resurrected but hadn't ascended. And what the Gnostic text showed is that there were these tensions and conflicts in early Christianity over the place of women and over the teachings of Jesus. Was he really claiming that he was God, or was he basically saying, you're like me, we all are both human and divine, we all have access to the divine, and you, as he says in the New Testament to his disciples, you will do even greater things than you've seen me do. In the Gnostic texts, Jesus is treating his disciples as apprentices and students who he's teaching to learn what he knows and to do what he does. And women are included as equals. And in fact, Mary Magdalene is the chief apostle. And she's depicted in the Gnostic texts as the apostle who received the fullness. She received the full understanding of the mysteries, the gnosis, what it means to bring forth the divine within you and bring forth that fullness. And she's the first to do that, and she helps to teach the other disciples. So these are the kinds of things that we see in the Gnostic text that we don't see in the New Testament canon. And so it really revised our understanding of early Christianity, that it was more diverse, it was more contested, there were more tensions and types of Christianity, and there were these beautiful esoteric mystic texts there. And then one more thing I'll mention about that is the feminist scholars, Elaine Pagels and Karen King, they've revised our understanding of Gnosticism.
Mm-hmm.
Karen Keem came out with work that explains that they're kind of, well, she's contesting what traditional male scholars in academia had done. They were looking at these early texts in the Nag Hammadi and a few others and saying, oh, these are Gnostic. There was this thing called Gnosticism, and they had Gnostic texts, and they all had the same view. And Karen King said, no, there were no Gnostics. That's a category that scholars applied to these different groups of texts. And she talks about how there were so many different types of Gnostic groups, and they didn't all agree, and they didn't all conform to a few or the same beliefs. And what they are is mystic Christians. They're apocryphal Christians. And so she says it's a category that was created. So she and Elaine have really revised our understanding of Gnosticism and Gnostic Christianity. And so even though we can't say that there's one Gnosticism or that you can define Gnosticism as a particular thing, after spending it for many years, I have sort of come up with my own kind of list of, when you look at all the different Gnostic texts and different types of Gnostics, there are a couple of things that I think they do share. One, and I would call these the core Gnostic ideas that crop up in all these different Gnostic texts, that there's a divine spark within us. We have a portion of the divine, of Godhood, the God within us. And it's our task to find that, access that, and bring that forward. And that when we access that, and when we access that connection to God, that direct connection that it has, we can experience gnosis. And that the more we do that, the more we bring that forward, the more it transforms our psyche and even our life, even our body, that we should bring that forward. And another idea that you see, again, differently expressed in the different texts, but that is common to, I think, to all of them, is that of course, that there's a duality, that our spirit and our body are almost mutually exclusive, not entirely, but very different things that belong to different realms. Our body belongs to the mortal, physical, material realm. Our spirits belong to higher realms of existence, and the two are working together. And when I mention that, I should mention that, again, traditional male scholars have tended to describe Gnostics as extreme dualists, doceticists, who only believe in the spiritual, who hate the world, who think the world is evil, materiality is evil and corrupt. And that's not true. I saw three different kinds of Gnosticism. I saw extreme dualism, the doceticism that believes that Jesus wasn't a human being. He was a being of light who just appeared to be human. That's the extreme dualism, the doceticism. And then there's modified dualism that you see in a lot of Gnostic texts, that basically talk about how Jesus is both human and divine and working with both. And then there's what I call Hermetic Gnosticism, which you see in books like Karen King's discussion of the secret revelation of John, where it's not extreme dualism. It's that the body and the spirit are working together and they affect each other. And so I kind of see all three of those in those movements in Gnosticism. But another thing that's about Gnosticism that is different than traditional Christianity is the notion of salvation, that salvation is through gnosis. It's through what you know and of the divine, how much spiritual light and knowledge and truth you are able to comprehend and receive while still in this human form, this human body. That salvation is what you know, and it's your ability to embody the divine rather than based on what you believe or some creed or what you ascribe to or how obedient you are. And this gets into all kinds of different tensions about what is the atonement? What is salvation? This was argued in early Christianity between the different groups and at the councils at Nice and others. And it was also argued between Gnostics and Orthodox Christians, because Gnostics were saying that we can be saved by bringing forth the divine within us, and we can experience divination and apotheosis. Whereas the traditional and Orthodox Christians were saying Jesus redeems us. We have to be saved by the resurrection, the death and resurrection of Jesus, and he pays a ransom for us. And so that's one interesting tension. That's only one of many. I mean, it's a big, complex topic, but I thought I would toss that out there as one simple way to look at one of the tensions between Gnostic Christianity and, say, Orthodox Christianity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. All of that is so valuable. And I wanted to share too, for just context for our listeners, those who have listened to Hidden Wisdom for quite a while. Um, Hopefully some of these themes sound very familiar, right? And hopefully you're listening to this and thinking like, oh, Megan talks about this all the time, right? And I wanted to say that Gnosticism was not a place that God initially led me to learn all these various things. I would say that it's actually a very recent kind of rediscovery. I had come across Gnosticism before, and honestly, the first read of it, I think I fell into one of those very dualistic, like the body is evil, the body needs to be transcended. That version of Gnosticism that I think also has a lot of misogyny written into it, and Sophia is evil and blah, 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 all these things. And so my first encounter with Gnosticism, I just kind of put it on the shelf and was like, okay, I don't know, that's weird. That doesn't resonate with me. And it's only been recently that God has brought it into my circle again. And this time I encountered what I would call as a very more Valentinian Gnosticism, which is much more, I think, authentic to who Jesus is, to who God is, and is much more respectful of the divine feminine aspect and all of these different things. It just resonates a lot more deeply. So I just want to say that for context of anyone who's listening to this and is like, oh, Megan teaches all this in Hidden Wisdom. But the way that I came to know these things was through my own Gnostic evolution. It wasn't just like, oh, I found Gnosticism and I'm going to ascribe to this as a new creed, right? Like this was
Right.
like genuinely, it was God. It was my own encounters with God, being taught certain things. And then God brought Gnosticism back around and I was like, oh shoot, like this is everything that I've been taught.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that because that's an important point. I went through the same thing. In studying all these Gnostic texts, I read some that didn't resonate with me. Sometimes they seemed elitist and condemning of people who weren't part of the Gnostic circle, and they were classifying people as three types of humans: the hyletic, the psychic, and the pneumatic. And if you were a pneumatic, a spiritual person, then you were the elect. But if you were a psychic or a hyletic person, you were lesser, you were lower, you weren't as inclined to be part of the secret knowers, those who are privileged to know the mysteries. And so there are aspects of some of the Gnostic texts that I find to be really elitist and exclusionary and kind of ad hominem, And there are some, like you said, there are some aspects of the way that Sophia and some of the divine feminine is treated in some of the Gnostic texts that almost feels kind of really sexist, which makes sense. I mean, sexism was quite prevalent in the ancient world. And yet, like any other text, whether you're reading the New Testament or the Old Testament or the Book of Mormon or the Doctrine and Covenants or the Pearl of Great Price or the Nag Hammadi, the Gospel of Philip, whatever, you have to read with spiritual discernment. You have to read for those moments that resonate with your soul, to hear the passages that feel like, okay, the divine was really breaking through this human in that moment when that person was writing this down. Because all scripture is an attempt to capture a personal experience with the divine, when the divine is speaking to us, and it's numinous, it's fleeting, it's momentary. And so every person who wrote scripture is just trying to capture one of those moments of divine experience. And sometimes it's not captured well. Sometimes the personality really shapes it. And so we have to read, do kind of what I call a mystic reading of the text. And it's interesting that in scriptural text, and this is a topic of hermeneutics pioneered by Philo of Alexandria, who applied Greek literary theory to Hebrew texts to come up with a model for interpreting text. And then later, I think Jesus is referring to it, and Origen, the early Christian theologian, is using it. But the idea that there are different levels of reading in the text, there's an obvious literal surface reading, and then there's a deeper reading that is kind of metaphorical or symbolic, and then there's a spiritual, a deeper kind of mystical reading. And I see it in Jesus's words when he's telling his disciples, to others I speak in parables, but to you it is given to know the mysteries of the kingdom. He's really referring to three levels of reading of a text. He's talking about the literal, the surface, the parable level, the story. And then he's talking about how he's teaching them. He's giving them, they are part of his inner circle. So they're receiving the teachings of the inner circle directly from him, the master. And then there's also the mysteries of the kingdom, where when you're reading the text and only the Spirit can teach you that level of reading. And so you see that, I think, not only in the New Testament and in the words of Jesus, but in these early scriptural interpreters in early Christianity who are looking at those different levels of reading. There's another thing I was going to mention about these early Gnostic texts. Another thing that crops up that's really interesting is the role of the disciples and the role of women. Because we're hung up on this idea that Jesus chose 12 men and they were the 12 apostles. No, Jesus did not call 12 apostles. He called 12 elders of Israel to represent the 12 tribes. He called many disciples, and he called a number of apostles, female first and then male. And so we've been hung up on this idea of 12 men, but in the Gnostic text, you clearly, and even in 4 Gospels, where Mary is the first to witness the risen Jesus, you see her as the apostle to the apostles, the first witness, and she's the first one sent. Apostle or apostolos means to send, the one sent, and she's the first one sent to carry the message to the other male disciples who are not yet apostles. I mean, she's the apostle. She and the other women, there are actually 3 women sent to tell the male disciples. But in the Gnostic texts, you see 7 women in particular in the Pistis Sophia who are selected, and they're kind of parallel to those 12 male elders. And then you can also discern in Gnostic texts, and even when you read the New Testament closely, you kind of see 12 women who are kind of mentioned as particularly important, including Jesus's mother, his sisters, and then women like Joanna and Susanna and Mary Magdalene and the Marys. There are 3 Marys who kind of parallel the Peter, James, and John pillars of Jerusalem. And you can kind of start to see that Jesus is assembling this inner circle out of his disciples, who are these chosen kind of 12 men and 12 women and the 3 pillars and the 3 Marys. And you end up with these 15 disciples who are kind of apostles, who constitute a kind of a group of 30. And there's a tradition in Gnosticism that Jesus needed to have these 15 men and 15 women as his closest associates who would mirror for him the divine fullness within him. In Gnostic tradition, the purpose of gnosis is to mirror and the fullness, the divine fullness of heaven. And when you have in Gnostic tradition, the Pleroma or fullness is constituted by 30 divine beings who are kind of like what Mormons would call Elohim. In Gnostic tradition, we call them the Aeons. And they are these divine beings, 15 male and 15 female, who together constitute this kind of council of 30. And they constitute the fullness of heaven. And the idea in Gnostic tradition is that if you have a gathering of 12 apostles or initiates who have received the mysteries, and you have 30, half male and half female, you have reconstituted a mirror of heaven, a mirror of the fullness. And there's a Gnostic tradition that Jesus needed those to be his closest associates to mirror for him the pleroma or fullness within him, to help him bring forth that fullness, which would enable him to fully reconcile himself to the heavenly and bring forth the heavenly and transform the human and go through the resurrection. And so it's interesting because in Gnostic tradition, that idea is really focused on bringing forth the divine light within you and bringing forth the fullness. And once you've achieved the fullness, you're transformed, you're anointed, you're Christed. and Mary first and others achieved that of his disciples. But it's a tradition I love. It's one of the more esoteric traditions of early Gnostic Christianity that I'm quite in love with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, to me, it just makes sense. The whole idea that everything that we have here is a reflection of something higher, right? And something more divine. I think that it really also gives maybe something to ponder in terms of what we have inherited about the idea of Jesus setting up a church. I think we have a very like institutional, presentist bias, like kind of view of what that means. Whereas like this is really shifting that to say this was not necessarily about an institution. This was about a a community of individuals that were seeking something, that were seeking a state of being, and that were
Mm-hmm.
facilitating each other's actual ability to become, as you were saying, this fully human and fully divine vessel that is so connected to God, that is embodying the highest iteration of itself. Like that is a totally different view than what we've received, and yet it resonates so deeply,
It
at least for
really is.
me.
It really is. And Megan, you expressed that so beautifully, I think. And it's so true. Um, those ideas are there in the New Testament, but they're buried. And they're there, though. When you read with the Spirit, you see them. And yet they're brought out much more clearly in the Gnostic texts.
Mm,
And so it's a different version of the story of salvation and atonement and ascension that does shift the focus to our shared divinity with Christ and with God, and our focus on bringing that forward.
mm.
And so it is. It's in fact, I was going to mention, um, books to read and things like that. I prefer to just focus on the texts because there are all kinds of books written about early Christianity, hundreds, and about Gnostic Christianity. But in my immersion in all of that, I just focused on the texts themselves. I wanted to just read the texts and see what they said to me. And so there are some really great books out there. I mean, to be honest, I really love James Tabor's book on the Jesus dynasty. I love that. And I love Cynthia Bourgeau's books about early Christianity. Her it's called The Wisdom Jesus. And then
So
she did
good.
another book on Mary Magdalene, The Meaning of Mary Magdalene. And what I love about Cynthia Bourgeau's books is she and I went through a similar journey and we came up with the same conclusions. And when I read her books, I was amazed that she had, in her journey as like this Christian clergy person, she had pulled out the Gnostic mystic inner teachings mystery Christianity, and I had done the same thing. And I think her books do a great job of pulling out that different version of Christianity. Along with Cynthia Bourgeau's work, I thought I'd mention a couple of my favorite Gnostic texts, because as you said, you mentioned Valentinus, and there are Gnostic texts before Valentinus. He's in he's in the second century, um, early second century. The the Valentinian Gnostic texts are seen as some of the most beautiful and the highest quality, sort of the highest level of teachings. Um, like the Gospel of the Gospel of Philip is a Valentinian text, and also the Gospel of Mary is seen as a Valentinian text. Um, and some of the Thomas texts, the Acts of Thomas is another one seen as Valentinian. And I love the Valentinian text. I love the Gospel of Philip, and I love the Gospel of Thomas. It was almost included in the canon, as the fifth gospel, along with the four gospels of the New Testament, but it was passed over. It was decided that even though it was just the sayings of Jesus, it was still a little too Gnostic for the church
It's
fathers.
pretty deep. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. But if somebody wants to start studying Gnostic Christianity, I'd say start with the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Mary and the Pearl. which is found in the Acts of Thomas. The story of the pearl is just the quintessential Gnostic story. It's this beautiful mythic story about a king and queen who have this son who's a prince, and they send him out. They first clothe him in beautiful divine clothing that his mother makes for him and weaves for him, and then they send him out in the world to find the truth, to find the most profound truth. And he's sent on this journey to find it, and he finds the pearl, he finds the wisdom. And then he comes back and returns home with this pearl that he has found. And it's a beautiful story. I also love a text called Thunder Perfect Mind. It's my favorite of all apocryphal and Gnostic texts. It's number one. And it's funny, when I was at Harvard on fellowship and I was auditing some classes with Karen King, I asked Karen King what her favorite Gnostic text was of all the texts. And she said, Thunder Perfect Mind. And I was stunned. I said, that's my favorite one. And I was really surprised, because when you think about classic Gnostic texts, you don't think of Thunder Perfect Mind. Thunder Perfect Mind is a Hermetic Gnostic text. It's really deconstructing all opposites, all binaries, and it's blending them together in paradox. It's a paradoxical text, and it's speaking in the voice of a woman. It's one of the few texts that speaks in a female voice, and she's saying, I am everything. I am the bride and the bridegroom. I am the father and the mother. I am the whore and the holy one. She's just deconstructing everything, and she's integrating all of it. And it's just an utterly Hermetic Gnostic text. And I really recommend that one also. But I think you just have to read the texts and see what pulls you and what draws you. There was a couple of LDS women who discovered the pearl in the Acts of Thomas, that text. They went crazy over it. They fell in love with it, and they did a book. Mandy Green, she helped with that book, and I've forgotten the name of the woman who worked on it with her. But they pulled out, and again, this is an example of what you're talking about. They looked at the whole, Thomasine text and decided, okay, some of this is weird. It's too weird. But this one section of the pearl is amazing. So they pulled that out and they turned it into a kind of a children's book. And just that best part of the text. And I really recommend, when I saw that they had done it, I thought, this is fantastic. These two Mormon ladies, found this Gnostic text and pulled out the best part of it and turned it into a children's book, and it sold at Deseret Book, so it's pretty cool.
Yes. We actually had her on a podcast. I'm trying to find, it was Lori Driggs.
Yes,
and
Lori.
Yeah, we did it. We did the podcast about the Hymn of the Pearl. And yeah, Mandy wrote she wrote an essay for it. That episode that we did was back. It was at the end of the book. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I think it was like a companion essay. But so we did an episode with her back in December of 2023. So we'll link that episode if anyone's interested in going back and hearing, because the Hymn of the Pearl, it is beautiful. And I love what they did with it. It's a beautiful book. The artwork in it is fantastic. Like, it's amazing. So
it's really, really wonderful. It's really wonderful. I love it. One more thing I thought I'd mention really quickly is that I always like to look for things that overlap and that are in common. And when I think about the early Christians, and then the Orthodox Christians, and then the Gnostic Christians, and then, the Jesus movement, I keep thinking, okay, was there one thing that they all had in common, in spite of their differences and their arguments about theology and the nature of God? Is God one or three? And is Jesus divine or divine and human? And something that I see all of those maybe having one thing in common is, in one way or another, even though they have different theologies that disagree, they're all talking about, even the Hebrew, the Jesus movement before it's Christian, this Hebrew movement, they're all talking about reconciliation. They're all reconciling the human to the divine. They're reconciling the human to the kingdom of God within us. And that we need to repent or be cleansed or whatever we have to do, or we enter into that doorway to the divine within our own soul, but we are aligning and reconciling ourselves with the divine, with God in some way or another. So I thought I would toss that out. as a
Mm.
cheap, easy way to try to reconcile all the different Christianities.
Yes, that is beautiful. Thank you for that. This was all very helpful. As you said in the very beginning, talking about early Christianity is such a broad topic. It's impossible to cover it in this amount of time. But I just wanted to say, and add that these are things that I feel I've been divinely led to in my journey and in my own pursuit of gnosis, right? Of my own embodied experiential knowing that I seek through the divine. Like, these are things that God has put in my path, and so I have found a lot of value in it. There is, as we have mentioned, there are things about Gnosticism that are very challenging. The cosmology is completely different than anything you've ever heard. And so that might be hard, right, to reconcile, and that's something that I'm still wrapping my head around. Although if anyone believes in conspiracy theories, this is a really interesting thing to look at, because it kind of sheds some light on that and why maybe the conditions of our world are the way that they are. But yes, some of the questions that this raises about Jesus and who he was and what the atonement
Right,
was, what salvation is, like,
right.
these are hard things to maybe deconstruct and view a different way. And I think that there's a reason why these things were excluded. There's a reason why there was a sense of these ideas are not safe. And ultimately, what I would postulate is that um, these things, which I believe are true, the truths that are contained here are incredibly empowering.
Hmm.
And there is an emphasis on your own direct
Right,
connection to God, your
right,
own spiritual autonomy and
right.
authority, your ability to, yes, pursue deep repentance and emerge as a transformed being, a fully human, fully divine being. And I
Right.
think that that was just information that thwarted the efforts of men who wanted power for themselves, right? Like, if you can walk this path of gnosis with just you and God, then you don't need an intermediary, right?
Yeah.
So what thoughts do you have to share on that?
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's a really important part of Gnostic Christianity and what's different from Orthodox Christianity. The emphasis and the focus is on your connection to the divine and your responsibility. You have the responsibility to discover the divine within you and its connection to God, and to bring that forward, to discover that, to escape the prison of false ideas and false teachings, like that you're not divine, you're just this sub creation, you are divine, and you have to find that. There are Gnostic texts that say, including in Thomas and Philip, that you need to do this before you die. This is one of the reasons we're here, is to rediscover our divinity while we're here in this flesh, that would try to tell us, no, you're just an evolved animal and you're going to die and that's going to be the end of your existence. We have a responsibility to find that pearl, that divine pearl of light within us, like the prince had to find the pearl out in the world, and to delve into that doorway, that access to the divine, to discover who we are, and to learn as much as we can while we're yet in this world, in this life. So the responsibility shifts to the individual for their initiation into redemption and salvation. And rather than the responsibility being on the church and its doctrines and its ordinances, which are helpful and beautiful, but the responsibility is on the individual and their relationship with the divine. And that's a very important tension that happened, that hereticated Gnostic and mystic Christians and their teachings. So I'm really
Mhm.
glad that you mentioned that.
Sure. Well, and again, I mean, we can see why in some ways it is more palatable to accept kind of the orthodox view, right? Of this idea of Jesus was the literal Son of God. He came here, he died for your sins. You have to accept him. Mormonism, our Orthodox narrative has kind of added on, you have to do a few other things. And then that's how you experience salvation or exaltation, right? And
Right.
in some ways, that's really comforting. It's a little bit more of a checklist mentality, as
Yeah.
opposed to, the true this Gnostic path, it is an increase in personal accountability and responsibility, and it's putting the goalpost at, no, you actually have to be transformed. You actually have to put off the natural man and become as a saint. And so that can be a little bit daunting sometimes, and I get why many people might say, actually, I'm good. I like the Orthodox narrative better.
Right, right, because it defers responsibility to those in authority and to the plan of salvation and things that they've mapped and charted for you. And that's good. It's good, and a lot of people need that. And there's great truth and wisdom, and there is spiritual gnosis that happens when you enter into an ordinance, when you attend church or mass and receive the sacrament or the Eucharist. That's a psychologically, spiritually transformative event. It's designed to transform your psyche with divine wisdom, and ordinances do that. An ordinance or a sacrament is designed to help you enter into the eternal within you, and enter into that intersection between the eternal and the mortal, the physical. And so churches and teachings and ordinances and sacraments are valuable. They're very valuable, and they really help you. They're a structure to kind of hold you. And this other path can exist within that. One of the things I love about Valentinus is that he was a bishop of both. He was a Catholic bishop and he was a Gnostic bishop. So he was doing both the outer church and the inner church, which is really cool. He almost became the Pope, but he was doing both levels of Christianity. Because he really saw the value of both. And so he was having the Mass and doing all of the normal Catholic things for those who needed that, and those who were ready for the deeper inner mysteries and to enter into this inner initiation path. He was mentoring those, and it's under his bishopric that those beautiful texts, Gnostic texts, were formulated and preserved, of Philip and some of the others I mentioned. And that's really interesting to me. I love the concept of the outer church and the inner church. That's been meaningful in my life because I love participating in the outer church. I love participating in Mass and church and the Eucharist and Mormon church and all the ordinances. They're profound. And I also have been on this inner path of initiation in my life. And I honor both. I honor both. Yeah. And the Gnostic texts, another interesting thing about the Gnostic texts, and like that you mentioned earlier, is sometimes they get really wild, and the cosmologies can get wild. But one of the things the Gnostic texts are saying, and one of the reasons why they kind of run afield of each other in different ways, is they're saying once you enter that personal inner initiation path, you're entering the doorway to what Carl Jung would call the collective unconscious. Mm-hmm. You don't know what you're going to find there. You're going to find all kinds of, there are these higher realms and higher beings, and some are light and beautiful and wonderful, and some are darker. And you're going to be encountering all of these things in the higher realms. And the Gnostic texts are saying, you need to learn, what's good and what isn't. The Archons are these spiritual beings who are guarding this world, and they're trying to keep you locked in ignorance. They're trying to keep you from the gnosis. They're trying to keep you locked in kind of subservience and obedience to whatever somebody else has set up for you. And so they have these different levels of beings, and then they have the demiurge, who they identify, some Gnostic texts identify as the dark creator, the creator who created this world in a flawed way and created a flawed world. But then the higher beings, the Aeons and God, the Most High God, saw a purpose for this, because we have to enter into this very flawed, harsh, cruel, dark world in order to really test our ability to find the divine within us and to recover the gnosis. So it all serves a purpose. But in Gnostic texts, you see them talking about all these different, layers of the cosmos and different beings. And again, some of those things will resonate and others don't. And, just like with any scripture, there are parts of it that will really resonate for you and other parts that will just feel like, that's not my path. Because your individual path is written in your soul. Your soul knows the way. And your individual path, you, Megan, yours is going to be different than mine, even though we're both on that inner path. And I'm going to be going through those realms, and I'm going to be connecting with certain aeons or Elohim or higher beings who seem to be there for me. And as I've talked to different mystics and different Gnostics and different Christians and different Mormons, they all relate to different ones, or what Jung would call the archetypes that inhabit that realm of the collective unconscious. Jung called them the archetypes. Gnostics called them the aeons. Mormons call them the Elohim. And Jung considered himself Gnostic Christian. He felt like he'd found the best version of Christianity when he found Gnosticism. And he is someone who recovered one of the early Gnostic texts himself. He discovered one of those,
Wow.
And so
I love that guy.
It's called the Jung Codex. Yeah. And so you have to, the Gnostics would say it's dangerous, but you have to do it. But you have to learn. You have to learn what is true and what is right. And you have to, and Joseph Smith said the same thing, which we'll talk about next time. But you have to find your way through that minefield of the collective unconscious and find out what is your path. Which of the aeons or Elohim or archetypes kind of have a role, a guardianship or an advising, a spiritual guiding role, or even a kind of, I don't know, sometimes I call the archetypes as possessing your life, when there's one archetypal pattern that just keeps coming back over and over and over again in your life. And you think, oh, how many times do I have to go through this pattern? It's an archetypal pattern that seems to possess your life, but we have to work through those. We're working through these layers of ourself, our own consciousness, and through these layers of the higher spiritual realms or the collective unconscious. And so we have to pray for guidance from the Most High God, the Most High God, above and behind and beyond it all, for guidance, and pray to the angels or the Elohim or the aeons to guide us to the truth, the higher light and truth, and to help us through the times when we do have to encounter a dark archetype or a dark part of ourselves and go through a dark night of the soul. We have to go through those things. And so it's that the inner path is more challenging, but it's something
the reward is greater.
Yeah. Well, it strengthens you. You have to become master of yourself and of how to navigate the dark and the light, and how to find the light in the darkness and develop the strength and ability to do that.
Thank you so much. That's beautiful. I so appreciate that. And I would suggest that this whole process is the embodiment of Sophia, right? So we didn't go over Sophia very much, but Sophia is one of those aeons, right? She is the divine feminine archetype most closely associated with the cosmology of this world. And the idea is that she is in a pattern of progression, right? She's learning, she's making mistakes, but she's taking accountability for that. And that she exists in us, that the spark of God that is in us is deeply connected to Sophia. Sophia means wisdom, and wisdom means gnosis, right? It means this knowing by experience. And so in some ways you can see her archetypal pattern, our archetypal pattern of condescending into a very fallen realm for the purpose of learning by experience and coming back into wisdom and knowledge of what is actually true outside of this existence. Like, we're all a part of that process. And I think Christ is the archetype of showing us how to do that, right? How to be fully engaged with the human experience and also fully connected to the divine reality that we are far beyond what we can comprehend right now.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up. I can't believe I didn't mention Sophia. So much to talk about. She led me to Gnostic Christianity. She's what led me there. And she has been there as an aeon or, archetypal being for me all my life, and come to me in dreams and visions And she led me to do my book, Women and Authority, and she led me to Gnostic Christianity. She is so important because, as you said, her story is, I think, the central story of Gnostic text. This is the central myth of Gnostic Christianity, that she represents both a higher being, but also she represents the part of us, the part of our soul that perceives itself as here in this world, so far away from God, the part of the divine that falls into mortality and into humanity, this broken world. And her myth, her story operates on those levels, the macrocosmic and the microcosmic on her personal soul level. She's one of the aeons, the Elohim or whatever, who, I should say aeons, who falls. She falls from heaven into this world because she chooses to, because she has compassion upon all of us, the people in the world, and she descends into this realm to help us and be with us. But she becomes overwhelmed. This world of darkness and the robbers and the thieves and the rapists, they overwhelm her, and she loses her sense of self. She loses her identity. She forgets who she is. She becomes overwhelmed. But then, as one Gnostic text says, Christ, the living bridge, the Logos, reaches out to her and reminds her who she is. And she has to rediscover who she is in this world through her connection to Christ, the Logos. She remembers who she is, and then she has to start gathering all the light. There are so many beautiful texts. The Jewish Apocrypha have some of the best passages about wisdom, Sophia, in them. And she has to gather the light. She has to bring forth the fullness of her own divinity. She has to gather it and bring it together. And the more she gathers it and the more she remembers and the more she becomes her divine self, the more she's able to ascend. And eventually she ascends through the levels, the lower levels of the Archons and the rulers of this world. And she ascends back into the realms of light to recover her true identity and her true place in the realms of light. So her story is the story of the soul, of our soul. She's, again, the archetypal macrocosmic level, and we are the microcosm of her story. Our soul is identified with her. I love a passage from one of the Jewish Apocrypha that says the wise men of old gave the soul a feminine name, of wisdom, Sophia. Our souls descend from the realms of light into this world. We fall into this world to be lost and overwhelmed and damaged and hurt and nearly destroyed and sometimes destroyed in order to be forced to find and discover that true divine self that we forget in this world, and to bring that forth and to gather our light self together. I have gathered myself together into one, and I know who I am. That's another line from a Gnostic text. And once you know who you are, once you have what they call the Gnostic resurrection, which is you no longer believe, you no longer have faith, you have experienced the divine and your own divinity and your connection to the divine, and you know who you are. And nobody can pull the wool over your eyes again. Nobody can convince you that you're not divine and that you don't belong to God. And that's the Gnostic resurrection. You have a sure knowledge. That's why the Gnostics are called Gnostics. They know, they don't believe, they know. And Carl Jung was asked that question. He said that he was asked, what do you believe? What do you believe about God? And he said, I don't believe. I know. I know. And so she has this partnership with the Logos and Sophia. And the way that we also have a Logos aspect is that our soul, and again, this is a Gnostic idea, our soul has these two aspects. It has the part of itself that's experiencing itself here in this world, in this third dimension. Then it has a higher self that is its Logos aspect that has never left the realms of life, that is still there. And our own Logos aspect, just as in the myth of Sophia, with the Logos reaching down to help the Sophia remember who she is and ascend, our logos aspect, which is still with God, which has never left God, is calling to us and reaching out to our Sophia aspect, the part of our soul that perceives itself as so far away from God. And they work together. And then that's the microcosmic level. The macrocosmic level is the Most High God and Christ, Logos, in heaven, who is reaching to us, calling to us, who sent the Spirit to ignite us, which we'll talk about next time.
So good. I love it. Thank you so much. This is also exciting, and I'm excited for everyone to dig in further for themselves. I would postulate this, kind of going back to the idea of the inner and outer church, is that these things are not incompatible with what we've received. I think that these are just for the spiritually, developmentally maturing crowd, right? Where it's like we have the outer church, and that's useful when we are children spiritually. And then as we grow up, we are invited into this knowing, to this spiritual adulthood that is this mystical path of gnosis. And I would say that, so much of the value of the outer church is that it gives us the symbols that teach us this process. And then we are invited to live and embody the symbols and experience the reality, the fullness, as you talk about, the fullness of what those symbols mean. And when you have the fullness, you also have the symbol. The symbol does not necessarily guarantee that you get the fullness, right? And so this is just, again, it's an invitation. If it calls to you, if it resonates with you, then it's an invitation for you. If it doesn't, then it's not for you right now, and that's okay. And wherever we are on our path, that is where we are supposed to be. All right, real quick.
Beautiful.
Oh, go ahead.
That's so beautiful. Can I add something right there? I'm so glad you said all of that, because again, I'll share two passages from the Gospel of Philip. The Gospel of Philip really captures the initiation and the entrance into the bridal chamber that exists within your own soul. But what you just said reminds me of what Philip says. He says, truth comes into the world not naked, but clothed in types and images, for the world will not learn truth in any other way. So we need the symbols and the types and the images, the archetypes, to draw us toward a deeper spiritual truth that's embedded in it. But we have to excavate that spiritual truth that is contained within the symbols and the images. Then there's another passage from, and I love that. It's one of my favorite passages. I love everything that Philip is saying about the bridal chamber. He's saying that the bridal chamber, the spiritual bridal chamber, the divine one, is different from the human bridal chamber. And he honors the human bridal chamber, but he says the spiritual bridal chamber, there's no night and the sun never sets on that bridal chamber. You enter into that bridal chamber and you become transformed, because that's the bridal chamber of your relationship to the divine. You can see it as your Sophia aspect, become married to your Logos aspect, or your soul and its union with God. But that the bridal chamber is the innermost sacrament of the Gnostic mystic initiation path, the inner church, the inner path. And I'll end with this one line from Philip. He says, the Lord did everything in a mystery, a baptism and a chrism and a Eucharist and a redemption and a bridal chamber. And so there's a map right there of an initiation path of 5 sacraments that end in the bridal chamber, that oneness, that reconciliation, where you are reconciled with God and you become one with your divine self and with God.
Right. And I would suggest that is the Gnostic meaning of atonement, right? To be made at one is this inner marriage of my masculine and feminine, my Logos, my Sophia, my higher self, my current self, my body and spirit, all of these things being integrated into one. And that is the fulfillment of the inner bridal chamber. And that is the ultimate potential of walking that initiatory path that I believe Jesus walked and was inviting us into as well.
Yes, it's the result. He walked that path and showed us. He told his disciples, do as I have done. He invites us in. it just, again, on the macrocosmic level, Christ invites us in and brings us in. And on a microcosmic level, it's that logos aspect, bringing in the Sophia aspect. But so it's kind of both, you know. I honor both the Christ, you know, on the macrocosmic level, the Aeon Elohim level, and then I also honor the individual responsibility of that atonement, that at one-ment. So I see it as both, you know, as both outer.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you so much. Well, this was great. We gave everyone plenty to chew on until our conversation next week, where I'm so excited we're going to take the next step of this conversation and discuss how it is that Joseph Smith was restoring Gnosticism and Gnostic Christianity. Perhaps you know, maybe you don't, because we tend not to emphasize it, but Joseph Smith was absolutely a mystic. And I think what he did was much more mystical than what we tend to know and hear in the typical Mormon narrative. So I'm so excited to learn more about that from you next week. Maxine, thank you so much for being with us and for sharing your beautiful wisdom.
Thank you, Megan. And thank you for your beautiful work on wisdom and inner wisdom. It's very inspiring. And I'm so happy to have connected with you. You're a kindred spirit, Gnostic soulmate, Christian, Mormon.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much.